All right, so what we want to talk about here quickly is mostly how to troubleshoot an overheating car. So let's take a quick look at the basics of your cooling system in any normal car. And again, this is an old piece of crap car, but it's a little easier to see stuff. We've taken the hood off and everything else so you can tell what's going on here. The basics of your cooling system: you've got your reservoir here, which is where you obviously fill your coolant and everything else. You've got the coolant that's inside your engine. You've got a hose going from your engine to your radiator, and then a hose going back from your radiator back into your engine. So this is what cools your coolant off, basically. Your antifreeze gets hot in the engine, cycles through here to cool off, and goes back into the engine cooler, and that's what keeps your car from overheating. The only other parts of the cooling system you really need to be aware of would be this little hose right here and his little partner right there that go into the dashboard. Those are for your heater core. So that's where the heat comes from in your car in the wintertime. When you turn your heat on, there's basically a miniature radiator and a miniature fan in your dashboard that you use to get hot air into the cabin to defrost your windshield and whatever. So that's really all you need to know basically about your cooling system. So let's run you through a couple of scenarios. Say your car is overheating. You happen to look down, maybe you smell coolant. Anyone who's smelled hot coolant, it's got a little bit of a sweet smell to it. It's very different from motor oil or gearbox oil or any other fluid in your car. So if you haven't smelled that, you can smell what hot coolant smells like, but hopefully you'll never smell it, but you know what that smells like. Your gauge gets pinned, warning lights start going off. The first step you should always take in that situation is, okay, maybe shift up, start driving the car a little bit easier. Turn the heat on inside your car. If there's coolant in the system and there's coolant running through all of these hoses that I just described here, when you turn your heat on in your car, your heat should be hot. It should be very hot. If your car says it's overheating, you should be able to turn your heater on full blast, feel your heat. It should be very hot to the touch. If it's not, you've got a major problem. You need to pull over because you've lost your coolant. So if your car's overheating, your heat isn't hot coming out of the vents in the dashboard, pull over. Deal with it immediately. Your engine's going to overheat. It can blow a head gasket. It could just destroy your motor. There's a lot of things that can happen. None of them are going to be good. So you're going to need to deal with that. Maybe a hose is popped or fallen off or been punctured. Maybe the radiator's been punctured, but somehow you've lost all of your coolant and you need to stop and deal with it right then. So that's sort of scenario one. That's how you can tell if you've lost your coolant. Scenario two would be your car says it's overheating. You turn your heat on inside your car and it's hot. That's a good thing. That means you've got coolant cycling through the engine and the radiator and the heater core and all of these systems. That's wonderful. Leave the car running for a minute. Hop out here, take a look and see what's going on. One, your fan should be spinning. If your car says it's hot, then, if this cable here was plugged in, if your car says it's hot, this fan should be spinning very quickly. If it's not, you've got an issue somewhere in the wiring. Maybe there's a sensor on the radiator that you've ripped off on a sticker. It's just worn out or something. Maybe these wires have sort of wiggled themselves loose, or something else has just gone wrong where this fan isn't turning on. That's actually not that big of a deal. If your fan doesn't work, shut your car off, let everything cool down again, and then you can actually drive your car without a working fan just fine, as long as you keep your speed up. Your fan's only designed to run in parked conditions, stop and go traffic. You leave it parked outside, you're sitting at a red light, you'll hear your fan turn on. If you're driving 30 miles an hour, there's more air going through this radiator than the little fan can ever drive anyway, so it'll never kick on the highway. It'll never kick on even on a back road. So if your fan is junk for some reason, Maybe the engine's broken, or maybe it's been dented here and it just bound up for whatever reason. You can still drive the car, just if you park it, shut your engine off. If you're stopped at a red light, shut your engine off and then go about your business again, and you should be just fine. So just don't stop the car, and if you do, kill the motor. You can keep driving it until you can figure out the real root of the problem and go ahead and take care of that at some point. But again, not an emergency. So let's say your fan is working. Car's overheating, your fan's running, everything seems to be okay. What can you do to figure out what the heck the problem is? The simple, easy test is to figure out, okay, where's the hose that goes from the engine to the radiator? In this case, very easy. And again, where's the hose that goes from the radiator back to the engine? Again, very easy in this case to see those two hoses. And what you want to do here is just compare the basic temperature of those two hoses. If your car says it's overheating and you come out here and touch this hose with your bare hand, it should be very, very hot to the touch. Like, you should only be able to, ooh, crap, that's really hot. Sometimes you'll get out here and be like, well, the car says it's overheating, what the heck's going on? The fan's working, everything's happy, I've got heat, what's here? And you touch the hose and it's not hot to the touch. Well, that's a problem. This one down here, it's not hot to the touch. Okay. Well, that means just the coolant in your engine's getting hotter and hotter, and it's not going through the circuit with the radiator to cool itself off. What controls that is a thermostat, which is a very basic little thing. It's the same thing you'll find in, ATVs, tractors, cars, trucks, anything. It's a little bimetallic spring that when it gets hot enough, it reaches a certain temperature and then it opens up. So basically, it's in the closed position right now, and when it opens, you can see maybe right there that this spring will compress. When it softens up at a certain temperature, the coolant will be allowed to pass through, and this little spring right here is what opens this circuit from the engine so the coolant can go through the radiator, get cooled off, and go back into the engine. So, if your car says it's overheating, neither one of these hoses are hot to the touch. Your thermostat has stuck in the closed position, which they do when they get old, for a couple of other reasons maybe, but most of the time they just go bad. It's really a $12, $15 part in most cars, but it will cause your car to overheat badly. And these little $15 parts have probably blown up more engines than anything else in the world, just because they stick closed. So what you need to do is ID where this is and either disable it or remove it in an emergency if you're really stuck on the side of the road. Typically it's very easy. Where this hose goes into the engine here, you should see just a couple of little bolts right there that you can take out. This guy, you can just pop him out with a screwdriver or grab him with a Leatherman or something and pop it out here. If you really had to, most cars you could just throw it in the back seat, put everything back together, fill the coolant back up, and keep driving. Just know that now the coolant's going to be passing very quickly through the radiator. So there's a little bit of restriction here. Even when this thing is open, there's not that big of a gap right there that the coolant's going through. So it's going slowly through the radiator to get cooled off and then back into the engine. Without this in the system, it's going to go shooting through this hose, dripping through the radiator, back into the engine before it has a chance to really cool down. So if you just remove this thing, that might also be a problem. You might have to drive the car a little bit easier, stay in a higher gear, keep your speeds up, keep a lot of air flowing through the radiator, and run your heat. Like I mentioned, your heater core inside the dashboard is basically a miniature radiator with a miniature fan. So if you can run your heat on full blast, that'll help cool the coolant down. So it might be a hot day, it might be 90 degrees out, and you're driving around with your heat on full blast with the windows open, but if that keeps the engine temperature down and keeps you from blowing your motor up, it's definitely a really viable option, and you want to do that. So if your thermostat is stuck, try just running the heat on full blast and driving easy. If that keeps the temperature normal, you're fine. If not, you're going to need to remove this or disable it. I've seen several times you can stick something into here and literally wedge it in there and break it off. I've seen people use a stick to do it before. I mean, it's not really recommended, but whatever you might need to do, you can jam this open and jam something in there that just holds that open a little bit, snap it off, put it back together. So that's a viable option. Or cut this spring. if that spring's fragile enough that you could take a pair of dikes or something and cut that spring or break it or bend it enough that that stays open, wonderful. Put it back in and you're good to go. You might be able to drive the car for another 100,000 miles without any problem. That's entirely up to you. If you do disable or remove a thermostat, just know that in the winter time, your car's not going to heat up properly, because the coolant is always cycling through this circuit with the radiator, and it's always being cooled off before it goes in. Your car's not going to heat up in the winter. If you leave it idling outside in the morning thinking, oh, I'll get my car warmed up so my defrost works and the engine's happy before I drive it, you could leave it running for 20 minutes, get out, and the engine still says it's cold. That's what this thing is supposed to do. It's supposed to keep that circuit closed off, so that the coolant, the engine warms up and warms up. Once it gets hot, then it circulates. So if this is removed or disabled, it's always circulating through the radiator. So if you live in a cold climate, it's not really recommended. But like I said, it's a $12, $15 part for most cars, and it's usually only a couple of bolts to remove it. So go ahead, get yourself a new one once you get the time and put it in. It's just a quick roadside fix to remove or disable it, to get yourself home, to get yourself where you need to go. So that's another scenario. What you might find, let's go back to the same thing. The car says it's overheating. You get out, you look, you check all the things we've already talked about. The fan's working. This hose is super hot to the touch. This one's cool to the touch. The radiator might be plugged internally. So one easy way to look is take a look at what your coolant actually looks like. Most coolant, regular ethylene, is going to be green. Some newer cars it's orange. It doesn't really matter, but it should be pretty nice looking clear fluid. If you've got any chunks and just nastiness floating around in there, you've got an issue. Something's gone wrong. The coolant hasn't been changed in 100,000 miles. It's whatever. But if you've got gunk and nastiness in your coolant floating around, the problem is that it'll pass through this hose, no problem. It'll pass through that hose, no problem. But the inside of your radiator is made up of a bunch of very thin little tubes that allow the coolant to go down through, and there's a lot of fins to help dissipate the heat to the air. So all of these thin little tubes inside your radiator can get plugged with gunk and old rust and whatever other debris you might have gotten in your cooling system. So that's an issue. So if your car's overheating, you can't touch this one. That one's cool. Your radiator's junk. It's plugged. So get a new radiator. Some shops will still actually be able to flush these out for you. If you can find a radiator shop that can clean it out, that's great. But for the short term, same thing. Just keep your speed up, keep the air flowing through, run with your heat on, full blast, keep that little heater core working as a radiator for you, and keep an eye on the temp gauge. If you need to pull over because it gets too hot, do it, because you will blow the motor or the head gasket or something else if you just drive it, but you should be able to kind of make your way home. At least you know what the problem is and you can deal with it as you have time. So back to the same scenario. The car's overheating. You run through all of those checks, everything's still good. What you want to do is come out here, same thing, check these hoses again, feel this one. If your car says it's overheating, this should be very, very hot to the touch. If you reach down, the one that goes back to the engine, what if that one's also very, very hot to the touch? It should be slightly cooler than this one. This should be very hot. That one shouldn't be so bad. If you ever come out and both of them are too hot to touch, that means your radiator isn't cooling the coolant down as it passes through it. One main thing that can cause that is if the front of the radiator gets blocked with leaves, debris, the front end gets packed with snow, for whatever reason. If you're not getting air passing through this radiator, you've got a problem. Most of the times, if you're following closely on a dusty or muddy road, you can get mud plugging your radiator, leaves, anything like that. Like I said, if you look at the front of your radiator, you should see it nice and clean, all those fins exposed. If it's not, you've got to clean it out. One thing we like to do is have a piece of screen that covers the front of the radiator, so that if it does get plugged, you can scrape it with a stick, you can whack it a little bit, whatever. The mud will dry off on the screen and flake off whenever you hit a bump, or worst comes to worst, like I said, you can scrape it off. the little fins that make up your actual radiator are actually pretty fragile and bend pretty easily. So be a little careful, obviously, if you're cleaning mud off and that sort of thing, but you need to do that to get air passing through, and that's what'll get your car to stop overheating for you. So if you've blocked the air somehow from going through your radiator, both of these hoses will be very hot to the touch, and your car will just start overheating almost immediately. All right, so this is a radiator that we've just taken out of one of the cars just to be able to show everybody that comes through the school here, and then you guys obviously, how it works. So this is what we're talking about, where there's a lot of tubes that flow vertically through here that we've cut away some of the plastic, and you can see the coolant comes in, trickles down through all these narrow tubes here, all the way through here down into this bottom tank where it goes back to the motor. So if this is covered or plugged with mud, you've got a problem. You know, leaves, anything like that, we've already talked about that. When you clean one of these off, what you don't want to do is mash these fins over, right? Because if I do that with a stick or something, now all of a sudden air's never going to pass through that part right there, and your car, the more you do that or rub it with a stick or hit it with a power washer and fold some of these over like that, you're gonna have problems. So that's one thing to really be aware of. You want your radiator to look like this over here. The more of these little bent and damaged spots you have, the less effective your radiator is gonna be. So really quickly, I want to run you through what to do should you get a hole in your radiator. So I'm going to go ahead and just damage this one here. You can see, say you run into a stick or something like that, and now all of a sudden that's happened to you. So what's going to be happening now is coolant's going to be spraying out of this hole. It's not really a good situation to be in. So like I said, all of these little vertical tubes here are where the coolant passes through. These little fins here just help dissipate the heat. So if you've got a wounded radiator like this, you just have to assess how many of these tubes have been damaged, of all these vertical tubes. Maybe it's just one, like I just did. Maybe you've got a hole this big and there's 6 of them that are damaged. What you need is a Leatherman or a pair of needle nose pliers. And what you're gonna do is basically just strip back some of the fins here. So I can just reach in, grab these guys and rip them out of the way, because what you want to get to is you want to expose the damaged tube, right? So it might take just a minute here to get it, but there it is. So this vertical tube right here that's been damaged, you want to strip back a ways so that you can check out exactly what's going on, how much of it's been damaged, where it's leaking out, and then there you go. So that's your tube, and that's going to be exactly where the leak's coming out. So what you want to do is, if you got a little piece hanging off like that, you can try and break it off, that's fine. But really this tube right here, one thing that tends to work really well is to crimp it, fold it back over on itself, and then crimp it again, right? And fold it back up, roll it up like the end of a toothpaste tube, right? And pinch it off like that right there, pretty snugly, and now you've cycled it over on itself a few times. Now that's really going to diminish the amount of coolant that's going to be leaking out of that hose. And you're going to have to do it to either side of the hose, because coolant can still come up through the bottom. It's still, there's a little bit of pressure in your cooling system that'll mean the bottom tube here is going to be leaking too. So again, just strip back all of these fins. This one's really fragile. I just keep breaking the tube again. A skinnier pair of needle nose pliers would work. A Leatherman's actually almost the perfect size for most of these. I was taking too big of a bite. I'll just take a few smaller bites. Should work better here to just expose that tube right there. And then you're just going to do the same thing here on the bottom one. Once you've got a fair amount of it exposed, pinch it off, roll it back on itself, pinch it off again, roll it back on itself again, pinch it off again, pretty tightly. I ripped a little hole in it right there, so I'll go a little further. You know, if you damage this tube more and more as you go, like I'm doing, because I'm a knucklehead, you're just going to have to keep doing it, right? Or break a piece off again and deal with it. But what you're looking for is just to crimp it off the best you can. Take your time with it, and you know, strip back as much as you need to. If you can fold it over 2 or 3 times, wonderful. So now you've closed off just that one little circuit. Top your coolant back off and see how bad the leak is. You'll find that instead of a steady stream coming out, now it's either just going to be dripping out or a little bit of mist, to where you might be able to drive the car. If you notice it's overheating, top your coolant back off. If you can't find coolant, clean water will work. Urine will work. You can use pretty much anything here. Nothing with sugar in it, nothing with alcohol in it, and you should be fine. So if, like I said, if you need to crimp off half a dozen, you know, if you needed to block off this much of your radiator, do it. Take your time, try and do a good job of it, because that might mean the difference between driving this car out of there and, you know, being stuck on the side of the road. If you do find after you've done this, you still have a slight coolant leak coming out of one or the other of these hoses, what you're looking for is something the consistency of black pepper. Black pepper works perfectly, and add some directly into your coolant. Some small particle that will flow through all of these hoses easily, and it'll still flow through all of these open tubes until it circulates all the way through the system, and it tries to escape out of that little hole and it'll get trapped. So black pepper, tobacco, I've heard of people crunching up, you know, other dry leaves that you might find in the forest or something into a really fine, almost a powder. Add those in. I've heard of it, and I've actually seen it's been proven that an egg will work for whatever reason. I don't get it, but it's been tested and it ended up true. So if you happen to have an egg for some reason, go ahead and try it. I mean, if your car's overheating and you're leaking coolant, that's your only way out. So go ahead and try anything. But that's the basics of how a radiator works and how to fix one that's been damaged.